What a great group. Thank you for coming out in the deluge today. We appreciate it. It is not a Chamber of Commerce weather day, but we're delighted to have you here. My name is Greg Reedman. I'm president of the Charles River Regional Chamber. Delighted to have you here. Wanted to welcome everybody who's here with us today. Particularly note we've got a number of city councilors and select board members in the room with us, and we're honored to have them join us for today's program as well. We are recording today's program, so those who want to see it again on new TV will eventually make the video available. And I want to mention we will share the slides that you're going to see at the beginning of this program to everyone who's registered, so you'll have a chance to see those as well. Thanks to our sponsors, Rockland Trust for being the title sponsor of today's program. Also grateful to Essen Susel, Real Estate's team, LoopNet, Fairlane Properties, Schlesinger and Bookbinder, and the RMR Group for sponsoring. Please give them a round of applause. And we're particularly grateful to our hosts at UMass Amherst and Jeff Knoyer in the back. Thank you, Jeff, for hosting us today. We're gonna, just to give you a quick idea of what the program is, we're gonna hear from Doug Howgate with Mass Taxpayers for about a half an hour or so, and there'll be an opportunity for a question or two if you're thinking about anything Jeff does. Jeff does talk fast, so like I said, you'll get the slides, but that's a good thing. And then we're gonna have hear from a group of young professionals who will maybe hopefully give us some good real grounding in terms of what it means to try to live and find housing in this market and their own experiences as we think about that. And then finally, we're going to hear from 4 planning directors from our 4 chamber communities. And I don't think they've ever done this before. We've put all 4 of them together on stage at the same time, so I'm looking forward to that conversation. So the Mass Taxpayers Foundation is an independent watchdog organization focused on state and local finances in Massachusetts. And one of the things they do is a lot of reports on various fiscal policy and policy issues. Doug, I think you probably do one every 2 days. It seems like they're always putting something out. But I was particularly impressed by a report they did earlier this year on competitiveness, the first of a series that compares how Massachusetts is doing to other states that we compete with. And I think there's a lot we can learn there. So I've asked Doug to join us and talk about the Competitiveness Index, but I've also asked him to talk a little bit about the state budget picture, something that I think is really important. We don't know where federal funding is. We know that's going to be uncertainty, so where revenue is for the state in terms of the programs that we care about in our municipalities really matters a lot. So Doug's going to talk a little about that and some demographic trends, but Doug, we appreciate your time today.
Folks, thanks Greg so much for inviting me to speak here today and for the opportunity to talk. And hold on, let me just put my coffee down and get situated and all that kind of stuff. All right, we're gonna do that. So my name is Doug Howgate, president of the Mass Taxpayers Foundation, and we're a think tank here in the Boston region. We cover the entire state, and as Greg mentioned, a lot of what we do relates to the state's fiscal health, but really what we look at more broadly is our long-term economic health and what contributes to that. And so my background, a lot of it relates to the state budget, and we'll start with that because I think it is critically important as we think about what the public sector, the role the public sector can play, shouldn't play as we address some of these overarching concerns. But we then want to look more broadly, right? And that's where we're going to get into some of the demographic issues we've looked at recently, also talking about this competitiveness index that Greg mentioned that we put out back in September, that we think really helps to hopefully frame some of the discussion that so many of us have heard about, is Massachusetts doing well, are we not doing well, how do we determine if we're doing well, who are we competing with, all of those questions that you hear so much about. So with that, let me get started with the state fiscal picture because it really has been a very interesting kind of ride. And what this chart shows you is it breaks down revenue collections, or tax collections for the state in kind of 3 2-year chunks. So the 2 years leading up to the pandemic, the 2 years of the pandemic, and then the 2 years since. And what you see is the 2 years before the pandemic, state tax revenues were growing at 3.3%. And that's a pretty standard level of sustainable revenue growth, right? The average annual growth rate for the next 2 years was 18%, right? States saw 40% tax revenue growth in a 2-year period, right? So as we think about when these kind of unexpected times, this was a time period when I think everyone expected us to do incredibly poorly as an economy, right? And instead we saw this explosion in tax collections. And now these last 2 years, tax collections have totally flatlined. They're actually even if you account for the income surtax that's on the books, tax collections are nominally down from where they were 2 years ago. So kind of how do you think about that? And are we in a good shape fiscally? Are we not in good shape? Kind of what are some of the contextual factors to keep in mind? And I think this is a chart that we come back to quite a bit, which says, let's take a step back and say, okay, let's imagine there had been no pandemic, and we were just going to take pre-pandemic revenues, so fiscal year 2019 revenues, and grow them forward at about 4%. So let's pick a relatively standard rate of growth. What level of revenue would we expect? And that's the yellow bar, the yellow line. The blue bars are actual collections. And what you see is, what's strange is not where we're at now. We're right around the yellow bar, and the surtax is kind of right on top of the yellow bar, right? That's what you would expect. What's really strange is where we were during the pandemic, right? We saw billions of dollars in increased tax collections over and above what you would have expected had there been no pandemic. And so one of the reasons why we are absolutely like our stock and trade is a little bit of doom and gloom in mass taxpayers, right? That's what we try to do. But why we haven't been kind of the sky is falling with tax collections is because when you look at where we're at, that's not the strange part, right? The strange part is really the journey we've had to get there. And just to amplify that a little more, so in the 10 years leading up to the pandemic, state tax collections grew by $11.1 billion. In the 2 years of the pandemic, tax collections grew by $11.5 billion. So a decade's worth of tax revenue growth in a 2-year period, right? And so that has huge implications on the spending side of the budget, has huge implications on how we build our reserves, how we prepare for what's next, and really what you're seeing kind of shake out in real time is knowing is the reality that we were never going to keep all that revenue, right? Some of that was borrowing against our future selves, and we were never going to maintain that level of pace of collections going forward. And so now we're on this kind of rocky ground where revenues are returning back to that trend line, and what does that mean for the budget? And there's kind of good news and bad news. So the good news is, I think budget makers deserve a lot of credit. One of the things they did was they put a lot of money in our state reserves, right? Our rainy day fund is about 3 times the size of what it was prior to the pandemic. They built up all these other reserves as well. I think generally they did a pretty good job of using federal funds and other surplus resources to pay for one-time capital uses, pilot programs, things like that. So that's the good news. But the bad news, or at least the fiscal challenge, is spending grew as well, right? So when you had these kind of significant revenue increases, you saw state year-over-year spending growth of 7%, 9%, 7%, right? As opposed to that kind of more standard level we normally see in the 3% range. And the difference in that is really where the challenges lay right now. What do I mean by that? Is when you have 4 years of 6% budget growth, as opposed to say 3, the aggregate impact of that in the budget base is about $4 billion, right? So the budget right now is about $4 billion higher than what it would have been if spending had grown at 4% over the pandemic as opposed to 6%. And so trying to figure out how you manage through and sustain that $4 billion worth of spending that otherwise may not have happened, that's where a lot of the challenges are really being felt at the budget, in the development of the state budget. And when you hear about FY26 being a challenging budget year, which I think it will be, a big part of the problem is how do we try to figure out if we can sustain and maintain these investments that were put in place during the pandemic. And that's why one of the things we've really been focused on is we need to get spending back into that 3% ballpark, right? And that's kind of wherever you stand on it. If you like the income surtax, if you don't like the income surtax, if you think our tax rates should be higher or lower, whatever, the bottom line is whatever tax regime you want, sustainable levels of growth long-term are going to be in 3 and 4%, right? You have to manage for that level of growth. I don't care what tax base you have, it's not going to grow at 8% a year, right? There's going to be, and so figuring out how over time you build in a budget that's growing at that 3%, if you don't do that, it's not just a challenge now, you're building up that challenge for yourself going forward. And so the good news is we did see a budget in fiscal year 2025 that got back to about 3% growth, right? 3.1% in fact. And that's going to be where things land in 26 as well. And I think it's going to be a challenging year. As we look at kind of how the budget is comprised, about 50% of the budget is healthcare, right? And a big element of that, and we'll talk about this a little bit when where folks have questions on what the Trump administration might mean for Massachusetts. That's 2 million Massachusetts residents on mass health right there, right? That's huge, billions of dollars in federal reimbursements as well. And so our ability to make changes in that area overnight are limited. They're not impossible, but they are limited. And the changes generally go to who is able to be enrolled and what level of services do we cover, right? Not super easy stuff to make changes on right away. So that's where some of the kind of managing those costs to 3% can be really challenging. And if healthcare is growing at 7%, that means the rest of the budget has to grow at 1% to get by to that 3% average, right? So that's where a lot of the pressures are going to come in. Now, when we look at tax collections in fiscal year 2025, which is the fiscal year we're in right now, the numbers actually look okay. Now, the big caveat to that in fiscal year 24 and fiscal year 25 is the income cert tax, which went into place for the start of 2023, muddies the water a little bit in how we assess tax collections. So when the Department of Revenue releases their monthly reports on tax collections, it doesn't currently disaggregate millionaires' tax collections and other tax collections, and that matters. And the reason why it matters is, one, millionaires' tax collections can only be used for certain things, right? Education and transportation. And two, the way they set up a structure for how millionaires' tax resources are used is there's a cap of how much of that gets used in the annual operating budget, and anything above that cap isn't available for the budget. It gets set aside for capital spending and other good things, but it's not available for the budget. So when you look at our tax collection growth now and you say, oh, it's growing at 5.5%, that's pretty good, you really need to know how much of that is the income cert tax, how much is not, because that's what is going to impact the budget decision that folks make. And we don't currently have that information. That's one of the things we're really pushing for. Those caveats aside, unlike the last 2 years, through at least the first 5 months of fiscal year 2025, revenues are growing at about 5.5%. So that's either no sign or a good sign. And it is possible that we're returning to those kind of ongoing revenue growth trends more in that 3 or 4% range, which is where we need to see them to build sustainable budgets. But that still means a fiscal year 2026 budget. So that's the budget development process that just started, where you're probably limiting spending growth to about 3%, and that's going to cause some really challenging decisions. We just last week had what's known in the state as the consensus revenue hearing. So that's a hearing where Mass Taxpayers Foundation, the Department of Revenue, other economic experts present testimony on where they see the economy going and what they project for tax collections in the upcoming year. And guess what? The median projection for tax revenue growth was 3%. Now, I will tell you, having worked in the State House building budgets and things like that, there's a very good chance that tax collections in FY26 don't look anything like 3%. There's a very good chance they're 8%. There's a very good chance that they're 1%. The challenge is, as you're building the budget, you don't want to bet on 8% revenue growth, nor do you want to build your budget on 1% or 0% growth for no reason. So that's why you often see the budget end up getting built around that 3%, because that's where it's going to even out to over time. And if you had to make a bet, that's the smartest bet to place. But who knows? You know, when we saw, for whatever else the incoming presidential administration may bring, when their tax package in 2017 happened, one thing it did is it boosted capital gains collections in Massachusetts. Corporate tax collections surged because of the way we couple and don't couple with the federal tax regime. So it's possible that we see a real boost in state tax collections related to federal tax cuts, right? That's happened before. So you could see some upside risk there. But then, as we'll talk about in a second, when you think about changes related to tariff policy, immigration policy, there's clearly some economic downside risk as well in terms of the labor force. And so you can imagine a scenario where the economy continues to perform quite well for the next 6 to 12 months, 18 months. You can imagine a scenario where that's not true. So as you're building the budget, though, probably the smartest bet you can place is to say, let's build a budget that's assuming about 3% growth, right? All right, so that's where we're at as we think about the revenues. And now, before I get into demographics and the competitiveness index, let's also talk about what are some of the bigger factors in play that are putting more pressure on the state budget. So one is the migrant crisis, right? So this is the state's family shelter system. I'm sure everyone's heard of this, read about it in the paper. Bottom line, what does this mean for the state budget? So this has historically been about a $325 million a year program that's now topping out at about $1.1 billion a year in annual cost, right? So that's from a purely financial standpoint, that's what the migrant crisis means. Now, for the last 2 years, the state has been able to use resources that it kind of set aside during the pandemic to pay for the migrant crisis, right? So we were able to shield the state budget from the fiscal pressures of the migrant crisis. That ends in fiscal year 2026 and fiscal year 2027. So that's when the real kind of budget rubber meets the road in terms of how we manage these costs. And I think that's why you're seeing the Healy administration be more proactive in some of the limits on stay and things like that, because they're trying to get that number down. Steward Healthcare, right? That's got a multi-year cost, currently pegged at about $700 million. That number's, if anything, it's not going down from there, right? And so it may not go up, let's hope it doesn't go up, but that's another outstanding kind of concern for the state. Every year we contribute to our state's pension fund, right? Those costs go up 10% a year. That's in order for us to pay off our pension liability by 2036, I mean. And that means when our tax revenues grow by $1.1 billion, by $1.2 billion, $400 million of that comes off the top immediately, because that's the cost of the increase to our pension contribution, right? So that's another kind of growing pressure. And then the other thing that's kind of the elephant in the room is, as folks know, we use $2.5 billion in federal pandemic resources to pay for state unemployment pandemic benefits. Apparently we weren't supposed to do that. And we're in the process of figuring out with the feds kind of what happens next. Now, under state law, if nothing happens, that gets borne by employers, right? That's how the mechanism works federally. Others are saying that shouldn't be what happens. That's not kind of who made the mistake. That's not why those challenges have arisen. That said, it's still a potential $2.5 billion challenge that we currently are hoping the feds say you don't have to pay us back or you have a lot of time, but we don't have an answer for that yet, right? And then the other thing I will say is during the pandemic, pre-pandemic, and also due to the surtax, there have been some major new programs that have been put in place or expanded in Massachusetts that have an ongoing operational cost, right? And maintaining those programs continues to be kind of maybe a major priority in the budget development process, but that limits the ability to do new things. So a lot of it's education focused. So we've got about $500 million a year in early education childcare grants, right? That's a totally new program, probably the biggest new state program in about 20 years. K-12, we've got the Student Opportunity Act. We've also got universal school meals, right? Those are a big expansion of our Chapter 70 education aid formula. Universal school meals is a new program. Those are major expenditures as well. Higher education, right? We've got now free community college. That was new last year. That's a new program. That combined with the kind of ratcheting up of some of the cost pressures on healthcare, that's really what's happening on the ongoing spending side to put this pressure on the budget. Okay. So now let's kind of wrap this up, put this all together. So the bottom line is we've been on quite a roller coaster ride for the last 5 years with the pandemic, with the revenue explosion there, then kind of the flatlining of revenue since then. And that roller coaster ride is not going to be over anytime soon, right? We're going to be in a new era of uncertainty as we handle the new presidential administration and some real policy uncertainties there. When you look at the negative revenues in the last couple of years, I think when you take a step back, the story is more the crazy uncharted territory we were in the years before that. And so that's why I don't think you've heard the same level of kind of fiscal fear in Massachusetts that some folks have expected. But as we move forward, what do we know? We know we need to limit our spending to sustainable levels. That means 3%. And again, that's with surtax, that's with increased revenues. It's just the bottom line is that is the level of kind of long-term sustainable spending that we're going to be able to manage. And we also need to mitigate in the budget for the fact that we don't know what the new administration is going to do with things like Medicaid, right? We don't know what the impact of some of those policies are going to be. And if anything, it's going to put more pressure on the states in some of those cases. Now, I want to be clear. Massachusetts cannot replace federal dollars dollar for dollar. No state can, right? That's not going to be kind of the option on the table for us. But as we saw in 2017, 2018, when you have federal changes in things like heating assistance programs, things like that, the state is going to want to adjust their policies in a way that tends to expand our costs as opposed to reduce them. So we need to build that into the budget as well. So that's kind of my fiscal update. And I will say, I want to talk with demographics, competitiveness, but happy to take any and all questions on this stuff or if folks have other things they want to ask about on that. But let me kind of take a step back now and look more broadly at this idea of competitiveness. And why are we as Mass taxpayers working on competitiveness so much, and how do we think about that? And I would say we started working on it for kind of 3 reasons. So one of them is, which I think got lost in a lot of the rhetoric over the last year, is many of the issues we're dealing with, confronting statewide and regionally, they have been present for a long time. They're not new. And these are challenges where wherever you're at on the ideological spectrum, we need to work together to solve them. And this is the bottom line one, right? Which is the state's labor force began declining prior to the pandemic, right? And if you look at, we've got another slide that shows, working age population in Massachusetts has been declining for 20 years. When you think about the long-term economic growth of the Commonwealth, it doesn't work if we don't have a labor force that can support our economy, right? Bottom line. And so figuring out how do you stabilize your labor force, how do you grow your labor force, that's got to be something that I think everyone is on board with. Now, how you do that, who you focus on, all that stuff, you can have very reasonable and unreasonable discussions about how to do that, but that's the bottom line problem we should all be kind of on board for, right? And that speaks to this idea of competitiveness. Because what we also know is we are not going to solve this problem, at least in the near term, with natural population growth, right? The state's birth rate is down 25% since 1990, right? So forget the baby boom. Over the last 25 years, the birth rate is down 25%. So when you think about kind of how you resupply the labor force, how you grow the labor force, that's not what's going to do it, right? We need immigration, we need domestic migration to play a role in how we grow that labor force. And that's where you come to the factoid that folks have probably heard a lot about, that Massachusetts lost 150,000 people over a 3-year period leading out of the pandemic. Now that number is about domestic migration. That is not international immigration. I'll come back to that in a second. And so we're just talking about people in the country who choose to move to Massachusetts or choose to move to another state from Massachusetts. And for the last 400 years, Massachusetts has been a domestic migration net loser, right? That is not a new story. And think of it this way. People are born here, and eventually some of them move to Florida, right? So they're in and of itself is your domestic net out migration, right? The issue is looking at some of these spikes, these downward spikes we see. And we have been in one of these downward spikes. And you could look at this chart and say, well, but we've been here before, Doug. And we absolutely have. The challenge is, when we saw a huge mass exodus in the early 90s, early 2000s, you were talking about a national recession that was worse in Massachusetts than it was other places. People were leaving for jobs, right? They were leaving for economic imperative things that when our economy improved, we knew those numbers were going to improve. When we see these domestic out-migration surges now, our economy's doing well, right? We have 2 job openings for every applicant. That's not the issue. Something else is going on. Something else is causing folks to leave, maybe because they can't afford to stay here or because they can afford to move to better options. That's what we wanted to really untangle. And the fascinating thing we've seen since the pandemic is when you look at some of the distribution of folks around the nation about where they're moving, where they're going to, and I'll come back to this in a second as it relates to New England, patterns that were in place pre-pandemic have been flipped on their head. Now this may be temporary, right? You don't want to read too much into 1 or 2 years of data, but this is domestic migration in counties in Massachusetts, right? So if you're above the line, you're a positive. If you're below the line, it's a negative. Who were the big losers? Middlesex and Suffolk County. That is absolutely a mirror image of what you would have seen in 2018. Who's the biggest gainer? Cape Cod. Like, that hasn't been true since 1620, right? So that's when you think about why are people making location decisions, where are they going, why are they going where they're going, something else is going on here. It may not be like this for forever, but we can't ignore this chart because this idea of like, hey, yes, we're expensive, but you gotta live within the 128 corridor if you wanna work in Boston, and you gotta work in Boston. That logic isn't as true anymore. And I'll come back to what this looks like in some of the communities around here in a couple minutes. All right, so we felt like this competitiveness overview was a good way to kind of unpack some of those issues and also get to I cut through what I feel like is a kind of unconstructive lens that we see on a lot of these dialogue, right? Which is, this is 2 stories that came out, within weeks of each other. Wallet Hub, Massachusetts is the greatest place in the world. No one would ever want to live anywhere but Massachusetts. CNBC, Massachusetts is the worst place in the world. No one would ever want to live in Massachusetts for any reason, right? Like, you end up with these black box metrics that we get a 9 on, or we score 49th out of this or whatever. And like, what do you do with that information, right? The bottom line, as we all know, is there's some stuff we're really good at. There's some stuff we're not really good at. Let's identify those things we're good at, and let's talk about the things we're not. And to try to like coalesce it into one number and say we're great or we're not great, I don't think that's constructive for policy conversations, right? And I think one of the things we want to use this to inform is to say, not every policy is going to be, by definition, done to improve our competitiveness. But this needs to be a lens for everything we think about, right? How is it impacting these things? Whether it's housing, transportation, climate, that this should be hopefully a constructive policy lens we can use to make decisions or assess decisions and outcomes. All right, so that's why we did this competitiveness index. And at its core, kind of the thesis we started with, and honestly we still are working with, is like, what's the bottom line? Bottom line is we have a super educated workforce. That educated workforce has this kind of positive feedback loop with economic sectors, but we're really expensive. And so prior to the pandemic, maybe we were in an okay stasis point where, yes, we were expensive, but you had to be here. As we've now maybe reduced the relative price of relocation, especially for higher income folks, or maybe it's become slightly more expensive relative to other states, does it kind of change that fundamental math? Is that what we see in the data? And I think you do see that a little bit. So what we wanted to do, and this is the beautiful cover we designed, is think about, okay, what are we competing for? So we're competing for businesses, we're competing for investment. Fundamentally, we're competing for people, right? That's the fundamental competition. Both the people who live here and people who might want to live here. What are we competing on? And we talked about this in terms of kind of 4 key areas. So kind of underlying demographics, underlying economy, and then the stuff that maybe you can do a little bit more about, right? Quality of life factors, business, employment, and investment factors. You know, all these things, there's a lot of gray area here, but we tried our best to kind of bucket them where they went. And then the key question is, who are we competing with, right? Because a lot of these, and certainly we as well, you want to rank us out of 50 states, but you know, we're not competing with Wyoming a lot, right? So how do we want to think about that? And we're thinking about that in 2 ways. So one, how do we think about our economic competitors? And what we did is we looked at data on job growth, job movement from state to state. And the 5 states that we are most likely to lose jobs to, ignore New Hampshire for a second, because I'll get to them in a second, but it's Florida, it's California, it's New York, it's North Carolina, and Texas. And we felt like that was a pretty good kind of pass the smell test of like, yeah, right? You've got some blue states there who have similar economies to ours. You've got some red states that you know, probably have different tax profiles that we're worried about losing folks to for other reasons. You've got some high growth states, non-high growth states. So we identified those as our 5 competitors. And then the other thing we wanted to do, though, is also look at our regional competitors. And honestly, if we had done this a few years ago, I don't know that we would have done it this way. But one of the things you see is, so this is domestic migration 2020 to 2023 in New England. This is the 150,000 people Massachusetts lost. Maine gained 48,000 people, right? Vermont gained people. Like, something different is going on now than was going on before, and we need to think more about how are we comparing to. It's more possible, I think, for folks to maybe live in New Hampshire, Vermont, Maine, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and still keep a footprint in Massachusetts, whereas moving to Texas, North Carolina is still a big life change, right? So I think we need to think more about that regional competition too. Hold on, let me just see how I'm doing for time, make sure I'm doing okay. Okay, I'll move real quick, Greg. So we will, bottom line, we did well in some things, not well in other things. And I'm not going to do, I'll come back to that in a second. And competitors, basically what you see is when you look at our economic competition, the kind of lower cost southern states consistently outperform us. Geographically, we are not really an outlier on the competitive stats, right? We're not that much more expensive than a lot of our other communities geographically. Economically, we are. But let's talk a little bit about kind of general competitive strengths and weaknesses, and then I'll do a little bit of local, and then I'll be done, I promise. So, biggest competitive strengths, there is a story here, right? And the story is this incredibly virtuous cycle of smart people, good K-12 and higher education, economic sectors that support them, and act as a magnet for international immigration, right? And like, if you were to have a draft of what characteristic you wanted your state to have, best educated workforce would go really high in that draft, right? Like, that is a really positive strength. That is a huge foundation, and it works so well for our economic sector, and again, this kind of the cross-connectivity with our education. So this is really good stuff. The challenge is, when you look at the things that we're not doing well, and so this is 47, 48, 49, it's all about cost. And then you look at that compared to this top line is our labor force between 2018 and 2023 declined nominally, and we rank 48th in the nation in terms of labor force growth during that time. So we're losing folks, and it's costs for businesses, energy, tax, unemployment, but it's housing, it's childcare, it's transportation, right? And so you start to see this idea that people are moving because they either can't afford to stay here or they can afford to move somewhere else, and that's borne out in the data. So much discussion is about who's moving, is it rich people, is it not rich people? And the bottom line is, we got 3 groups of people who are moving, and they're all important. One, our wealthiest cohort of families are most likely to leave, right? Just on a percentage basis, they are the largest share of folks leaving the state. That's a concern. But you know who's the second is like lower wage working families. That's the second highest, right? So you've got a kind of this sandwich of people who are leaving the state, and you need them both. And what overlays that is what we're most likely to see is young folks, 26 to 35 is one metric. If you 25 to 44, you'll see that a lot. They are most likely to leave. So people who can't afford to, don't want to afford to start their family here in Massachusetts, that should be a call for all of us, left, right, wherever you are on the spectrum. And the answer can't be to just solve for one of those things. It can't be to just solve for rich folks. It can't be to just solve for low-income folks. It's got to solve for a couple different challenges there. And so that's kind of the bottom line. And let me just finish with a couple charts looking at the communities around here. So Newton, Needham, Wellesley, and Watertown. And the bottom line is these communities are kind of better at what we're good at and worse at what we're bad at. So when you look at population with a bachelor's degree, 25 or older, right? Massachusetts #1 in the nation at 48%. Newton, 82%. Wellesley, 86%. Watertown, 66%, right? This is that times 10 here in this region, right? In terms of an incredibly educated workforce, right? That is a huge, huge, huge advantage. Median household income, right? There's kind of two ways to look at this, but also the median household income around here, much, much higher than the state, right? Poverty level, though, also lower, which is interesting because Massachusetts, our Gini coefficient our measure of income inequality is actually quite high as well, right? And so we tend to have wide divergence there in terms of our, in terms of the population. Here you got high income, you don't have much in the way of low income folks. Age, and I was actually a little surprised by this, and then I realized I probably shouldn't have been. So, aside from Watertown, when you look at, so this is percentage of the population older 65. So Newton trends a little older. Aside from that, Needham, Wellesley, and Watertown actually relatively young communities compared to the state. And that's also borne out on the right side is the histogram of this for younger, 0 to 5, 5 to 9, 10 to 14. And what you see here is Watertown doesn't have as many really young kids. Aside from that, these communities actually have a fair number of young kids compared to the state at large, right? So that's a big benefit as well. So as we talk about the challenges, commute time was interesting. So commute time is actually a little better here generally than it is statewide. Work from home rates here are way higher, right? And that doesn't surprise. It's probably because if folks chose to drive, the commute time would be worse. And work from home correlates with higher income jobs, right? People with higher income jobs are more likely to be able to work from home. So we see higher rates of work from home here, which is neither good, bad, nor indifferent. Though what we also know is folks who are able to work from home may also be more likely to relocate more broadly, right? So as you think about kind of that long-term challenge, that's definitely something to keep in mind. And then the last thing, which I'm sure will surprise no one here, is it's super expensive to buy or rent in this area, right? So when you think about those young folks as they, move out of their parents' house, as they graduate from college or whatever, their ability to rent here, certainly their ability to buy here, is heavily constrained depending on their economic circumstances, right? And this is something that is true for Massachusetts writ large. It is truer around here, right? It is unaffordable to buy and rent in areas like this. And so as we think about those long-term demographic trends, whatever you think about various housing policies, things like that, that's a big long-term concern for all of us, right? That if people can't afford to buy and live in the community they want to live in, they're going to move somewhere else. And given that we already have seen a decline in our birth rate, we've already seen a decline in domestic migration, it just stacks the chips against us a little more as we think about that long-term economic growth. So I know I ended that very quickly, and I'm probably right on time.
Got a couple questions? Yeah.
Yeah, so happy to take questions. Fiscal competitiveness, yes.
So, great presentation.
Thank you.
Nothing was a big surprise. On page number 8 or 10, you had a breakdown of the different areas of the state's investment.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I think it was 8 or 10.
All right.
What we talk about?
Yes.
Yeah.
It always amazes me, and since you worked at the State House, maybe you can share some knowledge. Why is it when, especially with the biggest areas of concern for the state, that housing and economic development are only 2 and 1% of the state's budget?
Great question, and kind of so two answers to that. One, this is the operating budget. If we did the capital budget, it would look different, but it would look different in 2 ways. So one, the slices of the pie for what we spend infrastructure on, housing is about 13%, 14%, economic development bill is about 10%. There wouldn't even be a healthcare chart, it would just be about state facilities. Now the thing though is that the state's capital budget is about 1/20th the size of this budget, right? So this is $60 billion, that's in the $3 billion range or whatever. what is expensive in terms of what the state does is pay for people and services that serve people, right? And so when you think of Mass Health covers in some form or fashion 2 million Massachusetts residents, right? 1 out of every 3, right? And in addition to that, as you think of how those services work, and it is not just covering their insurance, but oftentimes the state is the provider as well, right? For developmental services, mental health services, things like that. And so those labor-intensive, people-intensive things just tend to be super expensive. But so that's kind of the kind of practical answer to it, is that when you're paying for people and services for people, it just tends to be or does it scale on that and make it really expensive? The other part about it, though, on housing is, in economic development, is how would you define that in terms of how we spend the money, right? Like, what would be the thing that when you think of economic development and how we spend the money, I bet if we asked 10 different people here, we get 10 kind of different answers, right? It would be maybe grants for infrastructures in city and town. It might be micro grants for small businesses, but it's going to be a bunch of kind of smaller things, as opposed to if we say, what does K-12 mean? It means providing education services to kids under 18, right? And because one of the things I think economic development policy has struggled with in the last 20 years, since at least I've been around, is what is the thing we want our economic development policy to do? And how do we kind of focus on that, as opposed to focus on a lot of different very small things where it's some people that have a big constituency, that have maybe a small active constituency, but you don't have that same broad level of, you know what we should do is we should provide good health insurance for everyone who's at 250% of FPL and lower, right? And so I think over time it hasn't led to the same level of kind of policy coordination in those areas. And then in housing, what I'll say is there's a bunch of different ways that the state supports housing. A lot of it's in the tax code as well. So housing, a lot of it's going to be hidden from here, right? So this is just, if you look at the budget, where the money goes in appropriated line items, this is where it goes. But when you think of the affordable housing tax credit, when you think of the historic tax credit, when you think of some of the ways where the state uses the tax code to support housing development, they would be hidden from there. So it's a little misleading there. And then the last thing that I promise that's the end of my answer for this is, I also think that housing really, from a state level, there have been people who've been active on housing policy and how the state can make it more affordable for a long, long time. I don't want to ignore that. But I think it's really been galvanized in the last, say, 5 to 10 years in Massachusetts, and really since the pandemic. And so you're starting to see a big difference there. What do I mean? We just did a big housing bond bill that got signed into law a few months ago. It's about a $5 billion housing bond bill, right? The last housing bond bill was $1.8 billion, right? So it's 2.5 times the size of the last one. Now, $5 billion is still a lot less than this, and guess what? That's $5 billion over 5 years, and we're not going to spend $5 billion over 5 years. So the level of investment still is much less, but I think those are at least some of the reasons why. Yes?
So you characterize that people at all income levels are leaving Massachusetts. The high income, low income, people in between. There are many in our communities who say, what we really need to do is just provide housing at the lowest income levels and they call that affordable housing. I'd like to hear what you think about that. Do we need just affordable at the lowest income levels, or do we need it at all levels?
So I think we summarized the question.
Yeah, so the question is, as we think about the housing that we need, this big focus on affordable housing for the lowest income, do we just need affordable housing for the lowest income? Do we need housing for all levels? I think we obviously need housing for all levels, right? And I think as you listen to what FTF says on this, I'm sure Greg's been consistent on this as well, is we need housing production full stop, right? We need, and if you're gonna move the needle on housing costs, you need production. Now I will say, there are some practical reasons why the state's focus tends to be on affordable housing. One of which is, when we sell tax-exempt bonds, right, to support things like tax credits, that tax exemption goes away if there's not a public good associated with it. And historically speaking, the public good has been housing affordability, right? And so I'm not a constitutional lawyer. Maybe we could argue that there should be, that's an emergency for other reasons. But if you ask folks, hey, why don't we just do a $5 billion bond and sell a bunch of tax-exempt bonds to support housing of all stripes, which I think a lot of people would support, I'm sure a lot of people would not support. There are some practical reasons to say, hey, the IRS is going to say that those bonds are taxable, and it's a much different cost structure for the state, and it's less kind of an inducement for folks who are going to buy those things. So I will just say, I think the bottom line is housing production across all areas is important. There are sometimes some practical reasons why the state does what it does with its own dollars. But what I do think that leads to is, okay, the state, even if that was an issue, the state doesn't have enough money to use its own resources to just produce the housing it needs, right? And so that's why incentivizing zoning changes at the local level, incentivizing some of those things are probably the more powerful tool the state has, right? Because we just don't have the money to incentivize housing in every community. And so if there are ways we can get cities and towns to make it easier to build not just affordable housing, but market rate housing, dense housing, that's going to be a much more effective strategy to complement the relatively small level of resources to get to this first question to support housing generally.
One more question.
Sure, yes.
In your sort of looming cost sectors, you didn't mention or didn't have up there transportation, and I sort of have a sense that that's a looming cost center. What's your thought on that?
You know, transportation, we're good. Yeah. The slides only get so long at a certain point. So I'm on the Transportation Finance Task Force, proud member of the Transportation Finance Task Force that the governor created. But part of this is we focused on operating costs. And while the MBTA has a major operating deficit, that it kind of gets to the first question as well. We orient a lot of this around how the state budget is constructed, which is somewhat arbitrary at a certain point, but a lot of the incredible financial need we see on transportation happens and will happen outside of the state's operating budget. So that's one kind of tactical reason for it. But the bottom line is absolutely, I think transportation is a huge looming and current fiscal need for the state. And just to riff on this for a second, and then I'll stop, I promise, is so this Transportation Finance Task Force, which has been a great series of conversations, and one of the things we've written about and talked about a lot is the importance of using the state's millionaires tax, which, whatever you think about it, now on the books, focusing on how we're using those resources for transportation for a couple reasons. One, that tax exists, right? So for all we want to talk about congestion pricing, new tolls, new income tax on transportation, all worthy conversations we should have. We have a tax that is on the books right now that is generating $2.4 billion a year that can only be used for two things, and one of them is transportation. And right now we have no state strategy. We've spent the money for a year or so, but we have no state strategy for how we're using those resources for transportation. So saying we are going to use 50% of it for transportation, and at least in the next 3 to 4 years we're going to use it to address the MBTA's operating deficit, and we're going to use it for regional transit and a couple capital things. Is that the solution to any of these problems? No. But I will also tell you, having worked in state government for a while, we're not going for solutions here, right? We're going for how we make things better and continue to make things better over time. No one's going to find a silver bullet solution to transportation in the next 3 years, so let's continue to figure out how we appropriately price roads, price usage. But in the meantime, if we were to take $1.2 billion and spend it on transportation from the surtax, that would be the biggest new investment in transportation ever in Massachusetts, by a lot, right? And so let's have that as a key tactical, kind of practical element of the solution as we continue to think about how we also make sure we're thinking about these kind of bigger picture ones that sometimes can be a little paralyzing because they're so far in the future, or it's hard to kind of see how the rubber meets the road. And the last thing I'll say on that is, we have Jim Eng coming in to speak to some of our folks next week. I think that he generally has done a very good job in I take the Green Line into work, the reliability of the service, and I think just kind of the feeling around the MBTA and buying them some time to build some goodwill with the folks who use them, hopefully see ridership increase. I think that's an important real thing as well, so that if you're thinking about these broader things we're asking people to sacrifice for, you can not just say, hey, things are a mess, give us some money and we're going to try to make it better. Or to say, you know what, we've made some stuff better by using the resources that we have, but we need to make it better still. And so I think that's part of the discussion we need to have.
Excellent.
Thanks, folks.
Doug, thank you very much. Really appreciate it. We're proud to be a member of the Taxpayers Foundation and appreciate the work that you do every day. So,
Thank you, folks. Really appreciate it.
so I want to invite up John Rufo, who is chair of the board of the chamber, to say a few things and introduce our next speaker.
Good morning, everybody. It's great to see folks this morning. I feel like my hair's just kind of been blown back by that presentation. Not just the speed and the efficiency of it, but all the information. I feel like I need to sit and meditate on that for a little bit. So this is actually my last public event as your chair. Excellent, and it's it's interesting to have referred to myself as your chair, your outgoing chair, and your incoming and your immediate past chair in the course of a 30-day period. So Angela Pitter will be the new chair of the board for the next 2 years, and I'm excited by that she's stepped up into that position. From here, I'm going to be chairing the Arts and Culture Committee for the Chamber. We just formed the Arts and Culture Committee this year. Had a great conversation with Michael Bobbitt of the Mass Cultural Council the other day, and arts and culture is a bigger piece of the economic pie in Massachusetts than you think. So you'll be hearing more about that through the Chamber, I'm sure. I wanted to take this opportunity to talk about our the 5 areas of focus in our strategic plan and how they tie into real estate, which is, in essence, they all tie into real estate. So that the 5 main points of our plan is mitigating climate change, diversity, equity, and inclusion, daycare and workforce, transportation and housing. And I think all of those things, you can say, were very present in Doug's presentation here this morning. I'd love you to, as you listen to the next 2 panels and the information there and the stories you're going to hear there, to think about those threads and how they're both real estate based, as well as individual threads within themselves that we're going to focus on. You'll see us talking about that a lot in the coming year. One other thing is that all of this conversation, I think, a lot of it was pointing toward housing. I'm a Needham resident and a Needham business owner, and if any of you are, or if you've been paying attention whatsoever, you know there's a referendum coming up, and hopefully we'd like to get back into compliance with the MBTA Communities Plan. So if you want to know more about that, I urge you to go to yesforneedham.com and look up how you can help in that effort. Yes. Yeah, thank you. So, I'm going to introduce to you Max Wolf, our public policy manager. Max is going to moderate the upcoming panel of young professionals and their relationship to real estate. Great. So, thank you. And there's plenty of seats down front.
Thanks, John, and I'm going to invite the panelists up as well. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for coming out. Thank you, Doug, for the great presentation. I'm Max Wolf. I'm the Chamber's Public Policy Manager. And as that presentation showed, outmigration is a real issue for Massachusetts' competitiveness. And it's really felt among the young professional demographic the most, and they're bearing a lot of the brunt of the affordability crisis. So who better to talk to those young experiences than a panel of 4 young professionals who live and or work in our communities. I think this is a great panel, and I'm really excited to hear their stories. Cross my fingers they're going to stay in Massachusetts despite all the difficulties. But yeah, I think I'll just introduce them right now. From left to right, or my left to right, we have Caroline Cueva, a business relations coordinator at Good Shepherd Community Care. Michaela DeSantis, a senior development manager at Wellesley Properties. Tiffany Chen, a senior account manager at More Advertising. And William Ferreira, a wealth management assistant at Martin S. Kaufman & Co. So I'm going to start this off by just hearing a little bit about your stories and where you all come from, and specifically how the affordability crisis has affected where and how you live and where and how you work. Let's start with Tiffany. Thanks.
Good morning, everyone. As Max said, I'm Tiffany Chen. I'm Senior Account Manager at More Advertising, full service advertising agency based in Watertown. And been with the company for 3 years now, coming up 3 years in a few days. I want to provide you with a little bit of background. But before I do so, I also want to thank the Chamber for inviting me and Max for moderating this panel to really share our stories as young professionals. So my story, I grew up in the Needham area of Newton, and in a immigrant and low-income family household. I grew up through the public school system within Newton with my 2 sisters. And after going through high school, I went to college in Connecticut and worked there for a year. But after that, I moved back to Massachusetts. And in moving back, I lived with my parents, and I still currently am living with my parents. And I'll get more into that. And when I came back, I went through a few different jobs in the communities of Newton, Needham, and now Watertown. And as I am going through kind of my jobs and living at home, I've always wanted to live on my own again, but haven't been able to get that opportunity really, just because one, I had student debt, and that was really my priority in paying that down, and I had to really prioritize, should I do that or should I move out? And I decided to pay down my student debt. And as of a few months ago, I was able to pay down my student debt, and with that, Thank you, appreciate that. And because I was able to do that, I finally felt like I was in a spot where I could consider moving out. And in doing so, just to give a little bit more context as well, we lived in Newton with my family, but during the pandemic, we moved down to Weymouth, so in the South Shore area. So my kind of plan in wanting to move out is I want to be closer to Boston. Currently living in Weymouth, doing my commute is about an hour 15 on average, just one way, traveling 24 miles. And that can be a lot. And currently I work mainly remotely, but once a week I do that commute. And wanting to be closer, just as a young professional, I want to have access to more of the entertainment, food options, and growing up in the area, I would love to be back. But again, with the commute, it does take a toll, and hopefully I have the opportunity to move back. And with the commute as well, I want to, excuse me. With the commute, it's not just during the weekday when I travel. On the weekends, I find myself stuck in traffic. So to get anywhere from Weymouth to closer to Boston, it's 40 minutes plus. So that's really part of planning my day, and that back and forth, an hour and a half within an extra hour of days to get somewhere for entertainment, food. That's a lot. So right now I am looking to move back to the area, mainly looking in the Watertown, Waltham area. But in doing so, I also plan on living with a roommate, not living on my own because of the affordability piece of that. And in doing my search right now, luckily, because I'm still living at home, I'm not really forced to find a place quickly, and I'm very grateful for my parents for letting me live with them for all these years, but it's been a learning process for sure, and I'm very grateful that I have the time to really learn, because one thing that I'm learning is, for example, I'm planning to rent rather than buying, and in order to rent and start a lease, I would essentially need to save up 3 to 4 months worth of rent to start that, and I was not aware of that, and have to plan for it now. And beyond that, I think it's also learning that different areas and the rent and what they offer might not necessarily be what I want, and what I want is not necessarily in the areas that I want. So it's really a balance of finding what is that right place, where I can afford, and where can I really kind of compromise. And lastly, I want to say, in kind of figuring out where I want to live, I also learned that sometimes I have to, with the income that as a decent paying job, I still have to use a good chunk of my money to go towards housing. So again, I might have to give up certain aspects of my finances just so I can gain the freedom of living on my own again. So I'll close out with that, and I'm sure we'll share more in a little bit as well.
Yeah, thank you, Tiffany. I definitely feel having the need for roommates and many roommates.
Yes, Max.
Be able to afford here. And William, you also live near the South Shore. I'm wondering if you have a little bit of a different story, but if you could highlight your experiences as well.
Yes, so my name is William Ferreira. I work at Martin S. Kaufman CPA, which is an accounting and wealth management firm. I live in Braintree. My work is in Needham. Now, normally that's a 20-minute drive. Normally being without traffic, which is abnormal. Usually it's about an hour, maybe a little more, maybe a little less. And then my wife also needs to drive around 20 minutes more than that. Putting that into perspective, that is around 36 days. So that's around 10% of our lives spent commuting to and back from work. That's a huge amount of time, and that's a huge amount of things we could be doing otherwise that would be much more productive than sitting in traffic and being pretty miserable. I grew up originally in Rhode Island. Everything was very close because it is very small. But I moved to Massachusetts when I was around 13 to Pembroke on the South Shore. I went to school at UMass Lowell for economics, and I graduated, had a couple of bad jobs to start. My wife and I got married when I was 21. And we have lived together since then. And we both have incomes. We both have decent incomes, especially for our age range, and even doing better than the vast majority of people out there. You know, it's still a struggle to find a place, especially in Needham area. We just found a place after 2 years of looking in Dedham, and it's a little smaller than the current place we have, but both of these units are way lower than the market price in general. So we only got to move once we had to look for a long time, because while those median rents are, you know, a good thing to look at, they don't take into account the fact that they're not very nice, a lot of those apartments. And they are just smaller than anything else you would expect. We lived in Kansas for a while, and I mean, we had friends who owned a house and were making a payment of around $700 a month. So that kind of transition was totally crazy because there's nothing like that around here. And again, with a $2,500 median rent for 30% income, which is what it's supposed to be, you would need to be making over $100,000 to get the median rent. So that is something unattainable to someone just out of school, and for that reason, a lot of my friends are leaving, and a lot of people we know leave.
Okay, thank you, and we'll definitely get to your friends later. And what that means for colloquials everything. And I know, Caroline, I mean, you've had a little bit of a similar experience, but had trouble really finding it in Needham or close to Needham and Newton. Can you highlight that a little bit?
Yeah, of course. Good morning, everyone. My name is Caroline Cueva, and I'm the Marketing and Business Relations Coordinator at Good Shepherd Community Care. So I'm originally from Connecticut, and I went to UMass Amherst to do my undergrad. And upon graduating, I knew that I wanted to come to Boston because I wanted to be in the healthcare industry, and Boston is the place to be at if you want to be in healthcare. So I didn't have the luxury of moving back in with my parents right out of school, so immediately I had to find a place to live and rent. So like many new graduates, my boyfriend and I landed in an apartment in Brighton, where everyone starts, and we were paying less than $1,000 in rent there, so it was definitely more affordable, but it was very small. And about a year later, we had outgrown that place, and we upgraded to a townhouse in Chestnut Hill. At this point, I was working at a nonprofit in Newton, Good Shepherd, and from Brighton and from Chestnut Hill was about a 10 to 15 minute commute, so it was very easy, and it was a nice little back roads commute to the office. We were in Chestnut Hill for about 2 years renting, and this was a little bit more pricey, about $1,500 each. So definitely a big jump up from the previous place. And after 2 years of living there and lots of construction on the property, they tried to increase the rent once again. And at this point, we had gotten engaged and said we are sick and tired of throwing money down the drain, not making anything, it's just all going into this corporation. So we really were taking a look at how do we want our futures to look and where do we want to start a family, and decided it's time to purchase our own property and start making some equity. So we started the search using actually a few people from my Chambers Small Networking group, and we said, okay, well, I'm in Newton, he was in Quincy at the time, let's start the search local. Let's look Newton, Needham, Watertown, we'll be able to find a small condo or something. So we expanded, stretched our limits, let's look in some of these other areas. We went all the way out to Milford. And even there, it was completely outside of our budget. We lucked out and were able to find a small condo in Medfield that had actually, the previous offer had fallen through. And that was really the only reason that we were able to find it. It was a very quick turnaround. We went in, and that same day we made an offer that we got accepted a few days later. We've been there now for a little over a year and a half, and we've adopted a couple cats, and I've adopted a lot more shoes. So again, we are starting to feel like we need a bigger space, and if we are looking to start a family in a few years, there's definitely no way that we'll be able to stay in our current property with the size that it is. But there is just no realm of possibility of affording a single family house with a yard in these areas at this time. So it could potentially be meaning leaving the state somewhere down the line.
Thank you, Caroline. And Michaela, I know a little bit of a different story. You do live in one of our communities. How was that process, and how is it different?
Sure, so I'll try to be brief. My story might be a little longer because I have more time to cover. I'm on the older end / phasing out of the younger professionals. I'm 36, I turned 36 2 weeks ago. I grew up in West Roxbury, first generation. My father was the first one in his family to go through college, and feel really lucky to have grown up in West Roxbury in a single family home in a great neighborhood. I went to Boston Latin. Went to college in the Boston area, but after college I moved to New York, spent some time in San Francisco briefly, but really wanted to be home in Boston, and my mother has Parkinson's, and so being in the area is really important to me and my sister. And met my husband actually in grad school in Philly. He's from New York, and I said, you're welcome to join me in Boston, otherwise I gotta find someone else, and he made the right decision. But I'm currently work at Boylston Properties, and I focus on ground-up development, particularly multifamily, so I'm also in the business. And before that, I worked at Avalon Bay, and my husband and I were very fortunate. Dinks, dual income, no kids, if you're not familiar with the term. And we lived in the city, and we were lucky. As an Avalon associate, I got a discount on rent in an Avalon apartment building. That was how, with our 2 decent salary jobs, and with that discount, we were able to stay in the city and walk to work and walk everywhere, and we really didn't need to use the car. And so we got married 5 years ago. We now have 2 children. We have a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old, and we were in a 2-bedroom in the city with no outdoor space. We were preparing to move. We had started to look at homes now in the suburbs, thinking we wanted to go, for the space, for the outdoor space, the schools, community with young families. And it took us a couple years to find something. We'd search, we'd work with the broker, we'd get nothing, we'd get outbid, there'd be multiple rounds of bidding, and we'd get discouraged, we'd sit on the sidelines, we'd re-enter the market, and there's a lot of this back and forth, and we're very lucky. After a couple years of searching, we finally found a home in Needham, very close to the commuter rail, which is pros and cons, but so we live there, and it's great, and my husband takes the commuter rail in, but I went from, a nice 20-minute, 30-minute walk to the office to now a 15-minute drive to daycare with 2 children. You gotta get them in, you gotta drop off the stuff, you gotta get back to the car, and then because of the nature of my business, I'm often driving. I'm going to meetings in the municipalities where we're working on projects, so I do need the car. I can't take the train, and driving from Newton, Needham to Back Bay where I work 5 days a week, that's another 15 minutes from there. So the commute time, William, to your point, I've added like 2 hours I will never get back out of my day that I used to have before to either be with my children or prepare food or do work at home and anything. So we feel very fortunate to have landed where we did, but I look back and I say, wow, we were very lucky. We were very blessed. Like our parents paid for our undergrad. Like we didn't have that undergrad student debt. We have 2 really good paying jobs. And it was incredibly challenging to find a place to live.
Thank you, Michaela. And there's a lot of similarities in all of your stories. But I'm wondering, is that borne out in what you've seen with like your friends and your coworkers of the same cohort? And let's start with Tiffany. I'm wondering, is your experience similar, and how hard it is to really live in our communities and work here?
Sorry, can you, in regards to my friends or my...
Friends, coworkers, and anyone of our demographic, kind of expand the search just beyond you guys.
Yeah, thank you for clarifying. I guess one recent story that came up during the Thanksgiving holiday, my best friend who currently lives in Florida with her husband is looking to move to Massachusetts. She grew up in Massachusetts and have always wanted to come back. And they haven't quite done a deep dive in their search, but the first thing that came out of their mouths was, it's so expensive. And ideally they want to buy a home, and they want to come here for the healthcare, for starting a family, and for the education system. However, buying it doesn't seem quite feasible for them right now, and they are now looking to rent just as a kind of temporary solution. But with the uncertainty of housing, there's also the uncertainty of jobs. They currently work at a decent paying job in the Florida area, but moving up, does that mean they're continuing to move or work remotely? Is that even possible for them? And if they do find a new job, does the commute factor in? Because if they don't have a job, they're not sure what the commute will look like on where they live, and vice versa. So kind of the chicken and the egg situation. And again, it's disheartening to hear that they want to come back so bad, but it's making it hard for them. Again, emphasizing that they do have 2 decent paying incomes. And down in Florida right now, they do own a home and paid off the mortgage. So it's a huge shift for them. And similar in our demographics as well. So hopefully they'll be able to find a place and make Massachusetts their home again. But that's a challenge that I'm hearing so far, and that story is not unique to just them either.
Thank you. And I know, William, you have a couple stories like your friends too, but also I know you've maybe considered leaving at one point. And what goes behind that decision of, is Massachusetts affordable enough for you?
Well, yes. There was definitely a point where we did consider relocating before I got my current job, especially after moving to Kansas for her work for a couple of months and seeing that there were places where you could get a mortgage for $700 a month. And if I didn't have my current job, that would absolutely still be a discussion we'd be having. And it's a discussion a lot of my colleagues are having, and the people I went to school with. Out of, my 5 best friends who I went to school with, I'd say 4 of them have moved out. 1 to New York, 1 to Philadelphia, 1 to Portland. I have another one who went to South Carolina. And I think there's 1 person who stayed here. So that's a huge amount of people who are college educated moving out. And the other ones, the ones who are living here, were able to get a place in Shirley, which is pretty far out, about an hour from the outskirts of Boston. And they were able to get a townhome as they were married. But you kind of have to be married or have multiple roommates. And all the people who I was talking about earlier did have roommates, and they had to here. And they probably won't have to as they move, even to those high cost areas. And I've been speaking with other people who are a bit older, into like their late 30s, who are still living with their parents because they can't move out because it is impossible to afford rent for them, even though they're in a managerial position. It just doesn't work out because it is so expensive, and they don't want to have to commute from 2 hours away to finally get a place.
Yeah, and 4 to 5 people moving, that really puts a face to the demographic that Doug talked about. A lot of those people are leaving. I want to switch the conversation a little bit about other aspects. I know we've been talking a lot about housing, but what other aspects in our region, Newton, Needham, Watertown, Wellesley, even Greater Boston, what other aspects in affordability can this region provide to help retain young professionals? And I'm going to start with Caroline on this one. Is there anything else we can be doing or can be looking at as towns or anything else? Yeah.
Well, I did prepare an answer for the last question.
You're welcome to answer both.
Good Shepherd is a nonprofit that is providing end-of-life care to people all over Greater Boston. And most of them are in-home, located in Newton and within 45 towns in and around this area. Yet, with our 250 plus staff, I don't know of a single one who lives in this community, that's the community that they are serving. Most of them are doing long commutes, even to the point that some of them have left the state and now work fully remotely, only coming in occasionally for big meetings. My very good friend of mine who I work with, she lives in Southie, and if she doesn't leave at a certain time, she won't find parking. So that is also a huge issue, is if we finally get home, do we have somewhere to park? Can you repeat the new question? I'm sorry.
Just what else can Boston do besides affordability or Greater Boston to provide something to help retain these young workers who are really leaving, and you can see it in the out-migration statistics?
I don't think I am the right person to speak to it, but I think Michaela can definitely share some insight on the childcare options for us. So I'm going to pass it over to Michaela.
Yeah, does anyone want to watch 2 children? Almost 3-year-olds and a 1-year-old. We left when we were paying for full-time daycare in Boston. The cost of daycare for 2 children full-time 5 days a week is more than our mortgage. It's wild. And like I said, my mother has Parkinson's. My father still works full time, and my in-laws are in New York. We don't have the luxury of grandparents or other family nearby to assist there. So we do have to have 2 children in daycare 5 days a week, and it's incredibly expensive. Europe, right? The free childcare starts when they're 6 months old, 9 months old, or universal pre-K, anything like that would just be incredibly helpful. And having childcare also co-located to a certain extent with employment centers is critical. I mean, it'd be too much right now. We talked about do we keep our kids at the daycare in Boston almost, so when I commute in, that's just easier, and it's literally co-located next to my office. My husband works from home half the time, so we decided to keep it closer to our house. But even where we are in Needham, getting to Wells Avenue, that office park in Newton, still 15 minutes in traffic. And it's just incredibly, incredibly expensive, and they receive great care and we're really happy, but it's so expensive.
Thank you. And for the final question, I want each of you to do a brief answer. And there's a lot of municipal leaders in the audience, and if there's one thing you could say to them about affordability and helping keep young professionals here, I was wondering what would that statement be? And we can start with Tiffany.
I'm gonna think about it a little bit.
I will start. This is, as I mentioned, this is what I do professionally. So I in Avalon Bay, I worked for 7 years, permitting, building, leasing up, constructing, leasing up multifamily developments. And Mr. Howgate said it earlier, but we just need housing of all kinds. Market rate, little a affordable, capital A affordable, anything we can build, we need to produce housing. It's the more supply, more you increase supply, costs will go down. So for the municipalities, I'll speak to an example. So Boylston, we just received approvals in October for a Chapter 40B residential project that we permitted on Craft Street in Newton, just behind the Whole Foods, and it's 295 apartments. We're doing deeply affordable units at 50% of the area median income for 20% of the units, and we need to I don't know, work with developers more. Developers need to work with the municipalities more. We just need to produce as much housing as possible. And I'm not sure if this is in the municipality's purview, but you should be aware that it's unfortunate that now we're held up. We got appealed by an abutter, and that will delay us, a year, 4 years, who knows, millions of dollars in construction cost inflation, paying lawyers to litigate this. It's incredibly frustrating, and yeah, we just anything the towns can do to work with developers. It's really simple. We just need to produce housing and everything. We got to start there. People need to live somewhere if they want to stay here. Then we tackle the child care and everything else. But I think it starts with housing.
I think we also need some good education. When I was looking into buying a home, I said, okay, we're gonna buy a home. Where do we start? And it took a 2-hour conversation with our mortgage officer to explain the entire process, and she answered all of our questions, and it was so helpful. But before that conversation, we really didn't know, what do we need to start? What are all of the options that are available to us? So being able to provide education to our young professionals on what options are out there for them. How do you find affordable housing? How do you find things that are going to be within your price budget? And really just advocating for us to be able to buy our first home and not wait until we're in our 30s and 40s. We want to be able to buy and afford when we're still young and just starting out.
And I'll actually tag along with Caroline's answer is the education piece. I think I briefly mentioned in my story that me wanting to rent, I didn't realize that it ended up being kind of a learning process rather than just really finding what I want and that'll be it. Again, I'm not in a rush to find a place, but I'm really using this process to learn and finding a place, for example, in like a multifamily home and finding a place in like an apartment complex. There are different kind of pros and cons to that. And again, that's a learning process. One thing that I also learned was that within an apartment complex, the rate of a unit can change day to day. And I'm trying to factor in the timing of my move too. I've been told that maybe during the winter months it's easier and better to move, but is that correct? Is that standard across different communities? But again, going back to the point of like being educated, like what should I know going into this, and what is the right way to move forward and finding that right place for me. And again, I do have the luxury of staying home right now, so I do have the time to learn that, but I don't know what I don't know. So again, across different communities, understanding kind of maybe more of a level playing field would be really helpful for me.
Well, I guess for me, with municipalities, I think the big problem is, and always goes back to the way that we build at all. And that is through a process of panels and councils that go on for about a year before you can finally get a project approved. And if you can get a project approved is pretty big, because most of the time you don't. And the way we have things zoned, that businesses are in one area, houses are in another, and then there's industry somewhere else, it makes it so that you can't live really close to where you work. You need to go to the living area and you need to go to the working area, and those don't really merge. And I think there's a lot we could be doing to kind of get away from that, get away from those kind of very rigid rules about what we can build where. I know I've looked into a lot on the Japanese system. They have some of the lowest costs of housing in the entire world, even in an urban population. And that's because they allow things to be built within certain parameters that usually have to do with how much noise or disturbance they make. So you can have a multifamily next to a single family, next to a little, corner market or bakery, which not only makes things more vibrant, more interesting for your general life, but makes it easier to build because it's not just single family here, multifamily over there, businesses over in that corner. It's more flexible, and we need to be more flexible because things are constantly changing, and having these rigid structures means that butters can hold up the process for years of building, and just means that we can never build anything, and it just takes a really, really long time. So just to rethink that process and try to consider where can we change this so it reflects what people actually think in the communities and what they actually want.
Yeah, I definitely understand that, and for us young professionals, being frustrated with the process, and when we go to these public meetings, we don't see a lot of people like us. It's really a different demographic, and that's another issue, I think, totally, but it's something that I think we've all seen in the public process with housing and affordability. And I'm sorry, we don't have any other time for any other answers, but thank you all so much. Have a good day, everybody.
And we'll give me another round of applause, please. I think it's so important to put our face on the problem and do that. So, want to bring up the planning directors, please? We'll move right on to our final panel of the morning. Okay, so now let's talk about what we just heard and what that means for how our municipalities can operate. I'm really delighted to do this. I don't think you all have ever sat together in a panel, right? So, Barney Heath from the City of Newton Planning, Eric Arbeene from Wellesley, Newman from Needham, and Steve from Watertown. Delighted to have you. These are all folks that we work with all the time, regularly at the chamber, but an opportunity really to just talk about that. And so let's start. Just what did you hear from that last panel? And then how is it that our municipalities are either doing things now to try to help retain and attract those first-time homeowners, young professionals? We saw the demographic stuff that Doug talked about. Barney, let's talk a little about what is Newton doing? What are the good things that are happening? Maybe try to think about addressing this problem.
Thanks for starting with me, Greg.
You're welcome.
Good morning, everybody. First of all, I'd just like to say that I was super impressed with that young professional panel. I think they hit on a lot of points that even Doug talked about. And I can say in my own life, I've got two daughters in the same situation. I've got one renting in Watertown, looking to move. I can't find a place, and then I have a daughter in Somerville that's been looking for a home for 2 years, and she makes a good salary. So the problems are real. Not Newton specifically, but I am going to talk about an article I saw in the Globe yesterday about Austin, Texas, which is, I hate when Texas beats Boston or New England in anything. But it sounds like they're really kicking our butt in terms of housing. So I certainly think supply is part of the equation. I don't think it's the whole thing. I think we heard a lot about transportation. But you asked me about Newton. I think Newton worked really hard under the leadership of former Councilor Crossley, who's here today, to grapple with the MBTA communities, which I think a lot of communities in Massachusetts are grappling with right now, to come up with an equation that seemed to work for Newton. And really pleased about that and hoping that good things come from that. I think there was a lot of compromise and good thinking that went into that. And there's a whole unknown process about what that is going to produce and whether it's going to be something that the community embraces. So I'm hoping that it will. We don't have a lot of examples in Newton, but we do have a couple in Austin Street and Trio that seem to work pretty well. So I think that's a lot of the equation, is the unfamiliarity of what this is going to bring and what it's going to look like and how it's going to affect folks.
Great, thank you. Why don't we jump down to Steve from Watertown. Steve, if you could talk a little about what Watertown is doing to try to make it more attractive to you.
Sure. I think clearly in both the presentations, production of housing is a critical element. I think in Watertown we embraced the MBTA communities law and actually have created a plan for Watertown Square that reimagines the square and really creates a much more vibrant attractive place to visit as opposed to what it is today. And as part of that, the housing component, we're zoning for by right development, so it eliminates some of the uncertainty that was talked about in the last panel, and would allow for much more units than what the state was requiring. Per the state law, it would have been about 1,700, and we've created zones that allow for up to 4,000, a little over 4,000. So, I think we've taken some steps to meaningfully address that. One thing I'll add, though, that I think is a really important component is, as a municipality, we can lay the groundwork for that, but that also requires property owners, it requires lending institutions, it requires developers all to make those projects happen. And I think it's important to note that the municipalities aren't the ones building projects. And if the market is such that there aren't people willing or able to come forward and construct projects, we can lay the groundwork, and it's still not going to produce housing. But as a region, we need to be much more proactive in creating housing, I think, no doubt. And we're certainly, I think, doing that in Watertown.
Great, thank you. Lee in Needham, so in Needham, we thought we had just had the approval of a very progressive housing plan that would have really allowed opportunities in the corridor. Can you just explain to everyone, for those who don't know, what the scenario is now? Briefly tell us what the plan was that was approved by town meeting, and just what's up right now. I know you.
Sure. Needham had a very engaged process in coming up with the housing plan for Needham. There was a committee that was created. It was called the Hogue Committee. It worked for over a year and a half and did a series of 3 town-wide community meetings. And basically came up with 2 plan options. One I called the base plan, and one was basically called the neighborhood plan. And the first plan basically mirrored what the state's requirements were. And then the second plan, which was the neighborhood plan, actually increased the number of units from around 1,700 up to 3,200. And the strategy in Needham was to present town meeting with 2 options and to allow them to discuss them and decide which strategy they wanted to go forward with. And I give Needham a lot of credit. It opted for the more dense plan. There was a lot of support at town meeting for it, and there was support through the whole community process that was engaged in for that purpose. And that was ultimately the plan that was adopted. But presently, as you point out, there is a referendum pending in Needham. There was a citizens group that put a question on the ballot that's basically looking to overturn what was done at town meeting. And there's a referendum that's scheduled for January 14th, I think, to address that issue. But that said, I think Needham took a pretty progressive stance on all this. And independent of this, I think there are still some key buildings that will move forward with redevelopment. One is the Carter Building at West and it's Highland and West Street, which would see probably almost 200 units built at that location.
Great, thank you. And Eric, I know Wellesley is also engaged now in engaging the public in understanding the need for housing. Can you talk about the Wellesley housing plan and where you're going and what? Sure.
Chucks.
Thanks, Greg. Thank you for the chamber and the invite today. Happy to be here. Great presentation by Mr. Howgate and the young professionals. Hearing from them, I have 3 young professionals in my department that work under me that have varying commutes of different lengths. Some lengthy, some not as lengthy, but they're all in the same kind of boat. So I hear firsthand some of the issues. So Wellesley, we've engaged in a strategic housing plan. The town did a housing production plan trying to get to that 10% threshold. And the town did accomplish that, the 40B threshold, where 10% of the housing has to be affordable. Now that we met that threshold, what's next? And we've engaged a land planning consultant. We have a housing task force. We've just had a number of in-person meetings as well as on Zoom. We did a survey in town, about 1,500 responses far and wide, trying to get as many people as possible to engage in the plan and see where they want to go next with housing. It's a very challenging topic, no doubt, and it's a very complex topic. Anything housing, zoning, land use, and each town is uniquely different. Massachusetts prides itself on the 351 unique cities and towns and the character of those towns, and the people take that very seriously. So We have engaged in that strategic housing plan. Again, throughout the spring and the fall, we've had a lot of engagement. We're looking to have the results very soon of what this output said and what these public surveys and questionnaires that we ask folks. The consultant's currently putting that together right now, so we're very curious to see where we land with that.
Great, thank you. So I was at the last Wellesley housing meeting you had, and there was a number that was talked about that stunned me. Wellesley currently has 30,000 residents, but by 2030, it's expected to be between 25,000 and 27,000. So Wellesley could lose 5,000 residents in the next 5-year period. And I'll start with you, Eric, but then I want to ask everybody this. The population decline that Doug talked about, the out-migration, is a big concern to every employer who can't find a job, can't find workers, right? But the public doesn't seem to get that, because at every public meeting, they're worried about crowding and school overcrowding and infrastructure things. How do we get the public to understand that really we're going in the opposite direction? And in your case, Wellesley could lose 5,000 people. I bet you people in Wellesley don't understand that in general.
Sure. Yeah, it goes back to some of the stuff Doug's saying. Folks who move to Wellesley, it's very expensive. Obviously, the average price of a house is $2 million. So you don't have younger people because they can't afford it until their mid or later career doing that. So I think having the strategic housing plan and having the data put in front of them will definitely open eyes to see what the issues are. But declining birth rate. Folks are living in their home longer. There's a lot of different things, people not having as many kids. There's definitely a lot that goes into it. But, the strategic housing plan, we, just as we gathered input far and wide, we will spread the plan far and wide to get people to understand that. There's a lot of questions. We could have any type of event, and I'm sure my colleagues could say the same. I could have an event and say, any questions about housing? I'd be there for like 3 weeks because it's such a, it's such a varying and complex topic. It's also a very sensitive topic. It's people's largest investment. They take it very seriously. So, yeah, I wish I had a silver bullet answer for that. We do have this plan. We have a number of people's contact information, and we hope they stay engaged throughout the process and see what the plan has to say. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, we can put information on websites. We're currently investigating how to reach out to people better. I think that's another topic that I think my colleagues, at least some of them, can empathize with. How do we get the word out about this stuff? The death of the local newspaper has hurt us, and we're trying to figure out how to do that. So we do have the Wellesley Report, a local blog, which is helpful, but again, with the death of the newspaper, it's hard to get information out as it once was. Not everybody reads every day.
Great point. So Barney, I'll go to you on that same question. So you've sit through many, and I've watched many a public meeting where people just go out there and they spout any number or any fear thing they want. The reality is we're going in the opposite direction of population. Our schools are not crowded. Yeah, I'm sure all of you probably want to stand up and scream at some of these public meetings, and you can't because you're good at your jobs and you have to. But how do we get the public to understand that really we're going the other way, and this housing thing is really a key part of the answer?
I think it's hard for people to wrap their heads around the consequences of it, to be honest with you.
Yep.
Some people might think that it's a good thing to lose population, less cars on the road, easier for me to get around. So the results of that they have to be tangible for people, and I think you mentioned schools, that might be one of them. If there aren't enough kids to populate the schools, you're going to have to close some schools, and I know that has a real impact on people. And the economy, again, is another key piece of this. So I really think it's a Massachusetts story. When you asked the question, I was thinking about the Olympics. I always like sports analogies, and what communities have to do to get ready for the Olympics. I think hearing from Doug, we're kind of in the Olympics right now, and we're not looking too good in terms of a state, in terms of competitiveness. So we need to really up our game. So I'll leave it there.
Lee, so you work for the town, so you can't weigh in on the referendum, but I'll tell everyone here that we need a yes vote on this referendum on January 14th. But Lee, that process of educating the public, there's so much misinformation going on around this referendum, for example, and what the housing plan really is. What's the key? Where are we missing, if not just for this vote. But in general, to get the public to understand this is really actually not the problem you think it is. It's a different problem.
That's a difficult question to ask. We spent a lot of time in Needham, we thought, educating people, holding 3 community meetings to inform them. One of the select board members went around and met with all the precincts prior to town meeting to educate people about the plan. There were numerous presentations that were made. So I will say that in Needham, we came up with the 2 different strategies. We addressed all the issues in terms of transportation, in terms of education. So I think the town is well equipped now to answer the questions that are out there, to put people at ease in terms of what the impacts of the implementation of the plan will be. And I'm hopeful that I can't really speak as to my hope for the outcome, but I think we put out the information that's required so people can make an informed choice. And the information was collected and it was presented so that people will know the outcomes of the implementations of the various plans.
Great, thank you. And Steve, that same question, how has Watertown engaged people? What's the key there? And also, I'd love your thoughts about this media question too.
Yeah, well, I would say 2 things. One, I think it's very disconcerting to me and a much bigger issue than one that we can deal with, and that is that we're not all agreeing on what the set of facts are. Everybody used to watch the same news and have the same set of facts that you would debate, and now that's not the case. People come to public meetings with very divergent views of what they think the facts are, and I don't know how we solve that, but I think that's a huge issue, huge issue. The second thing I would say is, in terms of educating, is getting more of these kinds of people coming out to the public meetings. Too often our public hearings and public meetings on development projects or even plans are dominated by people who've lived in the community forever. They're retired and have time on their hands. They don't have the 2 kids to go home and take care of. And they come to the meetings and their perception is, what they believe. And one example is, what their life experience is. We had a development project and we had limited the amount of parking associated with that, and said that a lot of people looking for apartments these days don't have 2 cars. They don't need to drive everywhere. And I think for a lot of people in the community, that just does not equate. Are you crazy? No. Of course they're going to have 2 cars, and of course they're going to drive everywhere. And that's just not the facts for a lot of the younger professionals who want to live in the community. And having them come out to the meeting and stand up at the microphone and say, yeah, I want to live there, and no, I don't want to have 2 cars. I want to be able to walk around, I think is much more persuasive than us trying to tell people that.
Right. And as we heard in that last meeting, the folks who show up and testify at these meetings tend to be older, tend to already have a home. It's not the other population.
Fossil-like.
I'm sorry, what'd you say?
Fossil-like.
I said too old.
Too old. So Lee, I want to switch to commercial because this is obviously important to us as we're also attracting businesses here. And I would love to get everybody's thoughts about how we attract and continue to attract commercial development here. And it was only 8 years ago, maybe 10 years ago, that Needham offered a tax incentive to TripAdvisor and then NBC, and we brought Shark Ninja here and a lot of other companies. Where's the status now of attracting companies to our region? We used to be able to talk about international attraction. It's just not happening now. We're not seeing big companies moving in Massachusetts in general, but to our communities. What do we do?
Well, in Needham, we actually thought we were doing the right thing. We had a site in Needham, the Muzzy site. I think everybody's familiar with that property, and we rezoned that property for research and development. We went through an entire process of permitting for a lab space at that location, and now the property's kind of sitting empty and vacant. And so the town basically took the objective of creating the framework for enabling that development to happen through zoning and through a permitting process that enabled it, but it hasn't actually materialized. So I think it's more of a market-driven kind of an issue that's kind of driving it, at least on the Needham side, because we've created the zoning, we've done the permitting, and the market is not responding.
Barney, why don't you answer that same question about in terms of attracting businesses? Let's go Barney first, and then we'll go to Steve.
Yeah, I think this may have been brought up earlier, I think our role in municipal government is to reduce the barriers to businesses and do what we can to make it easier for them to locate. I think we're only one part of the equation, but that's an important part. So I know my colleague John Sisson is out here, and he's been working on little fixes in zoning that prevent businesses from locating in Newton. And we have a lot of those little fixes that we need to make and continue to have to do.
Thank you. Eric, we're appreciative that the town has a level tax rate, the only one of the three here that does that, and that is something that certainly makes Wellesley more attractive at a commercial tax level. But what else is Wellesley doing or thinking about to try to bring businesses here?
Sure. We also permitted for some lab space over by Route 128.
But it's still empty, right?
It's still empty, yeah, and that's kind of where they were all gun ho, and then it kind of just turned on its head, the market, and kind of like what Lee's saying, it's ready to go. They're ready to outfit it, but the market just kind of dried up. So in terms of that, we do have, since I've come to Wellesley in 21 on the heels of the pandemic, Wellesley Square has seen just an influx of restaurants and businesses. We've made some changes to our bylaw. We have this intent to dine thing, which limited amount of alcoholic beverage licenses. That's changed. I think that's opened it up. We see a lot more restaurants here in town. I know we're also working, the select board is leading a charge on an RFP for Wellesley Square on streetscaping and improving the streetscape, sidewalks, lighting, benches, that sort of thing. Linden Square as well, that's another one that is pretty filled up, with businesses. Wellesley doesn't have a lot of bigger businesses like Newton and Needham. We don't have that presence. Our presence on 128 is limited to the two office parks there. So throughout it's more of in the villages. We have Wellesley Square, Lower Falls, and those are pretty full. So we're happy to see that. We can always do better, and I know that Corey Tester, our assistant executive director, is part of the arts and culture subcommittee, and I think pushing that. I know the select board's looking at that to get people to Wellesley. We have an active business community there as well as the work of the chamber. In getting people, they have different strolls and things like that, and getting people to come to Wellesley. Again, it's a lot of retail based. We don't have a lot of, there's no manufacturing, or we don't have 8-story office buildings, so it's a little bit different.
Great. Steve, let's talk about labs. So Watertown has more mass bio companies than any community in the state other than Boston and Cambridge. The lab market, though, has gotten softer. Help us understand where that market is and what you think happens next.
Yeah, I was going to answer the question, but
you can answer that.
No, that's okay. Where's the lab market going? I think one of the things that's been really good in Watertown is we've created a real cluster of biotech lab businesses, and as an industry, they tend to cluster. So I think, in the sense of eastern part of Watertown, that we will continue to be occupied by those businesses. To the extent that the market comes back, I think they will come back to the places where those industries are clustered. So I'm very confident that those spaces will be occupied. It may take a little longer than perhaps the development entities had thought they would, but it's going to be the less desirable, the more marginal projects that I think are going to stay empty and or not be built, and some communities will unfortunately be impacted by that.
And what about efforts to diversify the kinds of businesses that are in Watertown to attract other kinds of businesses in?
Yeah, I think the role of municipal government in terms of economic development is really one of trying to make things predictable. I think that's what's most important to the business community, is when they come in and they look at a plan and they look at zoning, they have some idea what they're going to be able to do with the property and decide if that makes sense for them or not. And that they then go through a process and come out the other end with what they expected they would get. I think the industry, business community, industry, the real problem for them is if they come out at the end of that process with something they didn't anticipate and isn't workable. So I think for our perspective, we try to be as proactive in terms of predicting market trends and where things are going to go and what makes sense for us as a community to try and attract. But an awful lot of it is market driven and what's being financed. I think there's dramatic changes. 20 years ago, who would have guessed that all of our retail would be conducted over the internet? Yeah, nobody. And at that point, we're really attracting retail spaces, and not so much anymore. The retail is very much calmed down. Same thing with the lab business and how that became the development entity that was everyone wanted to build during the pandemic. Again, that's calmed down some, but I think it'll come back.
Everybody would love to have the retail activity at Arsenal Yard, so so I have one last question, and then we'll see if anyone else has questions before we wrap up for the day. So, at any given moment, the elected leaders in your communities or your officials are mad at me or mad at the chamber for various reasons, but we also work together in lots of different ways and partner together. And what is it that the business community and the municipalities you do? I mean, the municipalities that you serve and our communities have a lot of common goals. We both want to be economically vibrant. We both want a healthy tax base, diverse housing. We want to attract the best businesses here. We want varied transportation options. So how can businesses work closely with each of you in your communities to just make things better and go? And Steve, I'll let you go. You got the mic.
Okay, thank you. I would say two things. One, I think we as municipalities and business community need to work together. I think the idea of being competitive and, we'll give a tax break so this company won't go to your community, that doesn't benefit anybody. It really doesn't. It just makes lowering the bar, as opposed to working together. And if a company wants to move to your community, and great, and we'll get another one come in and fill that space eventually. I think working together, and same with the business community, working together with the business community is important for all of us, and I think that's a key. As part of that, I think it's important that one thing that you and I have talked about over time is that the business community can do a better job of selling itself to the residents of the community. I think that there's an awful lot of things that go on in the businesses in our community that residents don't have any clue about, don't appreciate, and don't identify as pride that, hey, that company in my town is doing this really cool thing. They don't know about it. I think the business community could do a much better job of reaching out and letting people know about the really innovative things they're doing so that they can take some pride in it and be more supportive.
Right, great. Like that bio company that you drive by every day is actually solving an important issue, an important health crisis. So, Lee, thoughts about that? How do business community and municipalities work better together?
I think I'm going to echo some of the things that other people have said, and that is that I think one of the most important things is that we recognize that we are partners with common goals, trying to accomplish and make actually better our communities. And the towns need to create a regulatory framework that is where people understand what the rules are, they understand what the timeline is and what the process is, so that we're able to create predictability in the system. And I think the other thing is, I think for us as collaborative towns is to understand that we're all in this together, and if a developer comes in, is interested in a property, and Needham can't accommodate them, but there are other communities in the region where there might be real estate available, and we can partner and direct those clients to other locations.
Great. Eric, same question.
Kind of beating the same drum here, but from the Charles River Regional Chamber of Commerce, and if the business doesn't come to Wellesley, it goes to Needham. I can guarantee you the people in Wellesley will go to that business, or they might work at that business. So it's definitely a regional approach to it, and the chamber doing a job of does a great job of promoting the region and all the benefits of it, and showing how great we are. Obviously, it's a very affluent, desirable area that a lot of businesses want to get in for various demographics and whatnot. But I think it's not a silo to us against Needham, us against Newton. That's how I don't view it like that. This is 21st century. People cross town lines all the time, and having that regional approach, I think it's kind of a rising tide lifts all boats type of an aspect.
Hey, Barney, get the last word on this one.
Yeah, just real quickly, I think it's all about engagement a little bit. So I've seen you at multiple public hearings, Greg, and you wait around for your turn to speak. But I really struggle to think of how many businesses that I've seen testify at public meetings that could have an impact on what results.
Fair enough, although I will say that when it's a 3-hour public hearing and you've got a business owner the next morning, it's really hard to get business owners there. And business owners also don't always want to get in the fray of being on the opposite side of that half the room is angry at you. But it's a real problem. All right, who's got a question? Go ahead. William, sorry.
So you've all talked a lot about changing situations in towns and municipalities, like town meetings aren't really representative, town newspapers don't exist anymore, businesses aren't building where you're zoning, and the economy's constantly changing, shifting, you're not sure what's going to be built. My question is, if you know all these things are true and that communities aren't really being represented, why hasn't there been any change or push for change in the municipal decision-making process as a whole? Why aren't governments adapting to the new environment?
So the question is, why aren't our cities and towns adapting to some of the changing demands? Any thoughts on that?
Steve's got it. Yeah, we'll take this one.
Well, I would say we are. I think we do. We have looked at a lot of different ways to reach out to the public. A lot more is done digitally now and online, as opposed to just simply relying on who shows up at a public meeting. And I think that's important. We have, I forget the name of it, but a system to send out questions to a scientifically valid cross-section of the community where they can vote on particular issues. And, not that that's a be-all, end-all or decision-making, but it provides a really good input back to the community, and by doing that, we're getting a cross-section of the community, not just, again, the same people that show up at a public hearing. So I think we are doing some of those things. We're very fortunate in the Watertown Square process that a significant cohort of people who are young professionals got very organized and really did make housing a really front and center issue for the public hearing process. And I think that was very important in terms of, for us, being able to say back to some of the other members of the community that there are two sides of that story. It's not just people who are concerned about more traffic and impacts, but a lot of people are very concerned about having more housing and having that balance.
Great. Unless somebody has anything to add, we have more questions in time, so we could go on. Yes, sorry.
My name's Deirdre O'Connor. I'm a real estate agent in the area, and I've also raised 2 kids in Newton since 2013. I've been really watching the shift with the just working behavior. Like, people want to be at home, people want to integrate into urban communities, etc. So you all have vacant property for commercial space. Has there been any thought on how to do kind of like counter trade with the new companies that could potentially come in, where, let's say they have a 10-foot building and every other building is housing, or the first 5 floors are housing and then the top 5 are their business space? So that it's very different, but it's integrated, and even maybe there's a child care center on the first floor where there would be traditionally commercial.
So I think the question is really, do we turn buildings upside down and put commercial on top? And
Whatever. Start getting creative, because I'm assuming the companies aren't coming in because they don't have the employees at the really worker level who can afford to live in our communities. So how do you counter trade that with, we're going to give you some subsidized housing. It's not going to be huge. It's going to be a 1-bedroom, 1-bath, or it's going to be a 2-bed, 2-bath, but we're going to have community spaces within the structure so that you can socialize. Google, to a degree, has done this in their expensive communities in California. They put all the services on site, so they kind of keep their employees happy, their salaries are higher, and I'll stop talking now.
Anybody have any thoughts on that? I mean, I think that a lot of the zoning changes in MBTA communities and these things do try to do some of that.
I think that some of our zoning actually, I think from the town's perspective, I think it's having zoning and regulations that don't maybe get in the way of that happening. And I think to the extent that you're allowing mixed-use development to happen in a specific geographical area, and those choices to be made on the private side creates the envelope in which that can be expressed. So I would say by doing mixed-use development and recognizing those variable uses, it allows the private sector to step in and implement that in those circumstances where they feel it's appropriate, and that's their goal.
Daryl, you had a question?
Yes, great information. I had not heard the statistic that Wellesley may lose up to 15+% of their residents over the next 5 years. If that's the case, what do you need more housing? And then I'll just also wonder that, and what is the number for the other municipalities in terms of increase or decrease in their number of residents over the next 5 years, if you have that information?
I don't have it for the other towns off the top of my head, but that was one projection. And we know it's a projection. I know that they look at 3 different outcomes. And housing's a regional problem. You know, there's not a lot of vacancy in town. There is some vacancy in terms of the higher end. You know, the $6, $7, $8 million houses, talking to realtors, are much harder to sell than the $1 or $2 million houses. Those are much easier to sell. But the housing crisis is a regional crisis. We don't see that. I mean, that's what the projections say, and I assume it has to do with the demographics.
So they're all moving to Florida?
I think some of the in Wellesley, I think some of the higher end income folks, this is one of 2 or 3 properties they own. They're here for part of the time. They go down to Florida. They go on the Cape in the summer, that sort of thing. So in talking about, I think the last question was about mixed use too. We do have our squares allow for mixed use, allow 17 units an acre, and there's been a lot of long-time property owners that just haven't engaged in it. We're seeing a turnover in the town's largest property owner, which I suspect will result in some different things than what we're seeing before. So, you know, we do have some zoning in place in the commercial areas in the downtown. That's what the town likes to see, and we just haven't seen it yet. I suspect you'll probably see it sooner, especially with MBTA and how we zoned and getting rid of a special permit for these areas. Again, predictability, what Steve was saying and Lee was saying, is one of the bigger things for developers, the predictability of what's going to happen, what permits do they need, what does this process look like, because time is money, obviously.
So I'd love to hear what others think about that. What's the trend in terms of projections, in terms of population, and does that mean we don't need to build more housing? We're problem solved.
So I think Newton's pretty stable in terms of population. It's grown a little bit in the past 10 years. It's still a very desirable place. I don't see that changing. So I think it's the population mix that we're talking about, and losing that kind of demographic between 25 and 40 that's important for Newton, and having options for folks like that to live in the community.
Great. Steve, Lee.
Sure.
I would say that like Newton, Needham's population is relatively stable. I think the issue here is really addressing the regional housing need. And I think in Needham's case, it's lost a lot of its economic diversity, and there's an interest and a desire in opening up the community to a wide range of folks of different incomes and different backgrounds, and that actually creates a rich environment for all of us to live in.
I would say a couple things. One, I think Watertown's growing, not by leaps and bounds, but growing in population. But predictions are one aspect, and I think we have an engine in higher education in this region that is tremendous in terms of bringing talent into this area. And if we produce housing that is affordable, that population will grow. If we don't, it won't. And I think that's kind of more of a message I would take from today's discussion.
Yeah, thanks for setting that one up, Daryl, so we can get it. All right, one last question, somebody? Go ahead. Yes, you. I'm sorry, I can't see who you are.
Why do you think people feel it's overcrowded if we're not overcrowded?
Why do people feel it's overcrowded if we're not? Who wants to get a shot at that one? Eric?
Sorry. One of the most common things we hear is traffic. They think it's overcrowded. We recently, 2 multifamily unit buildings were developed, and people, traffic. It's going to be horrible with traffic. I drive by one of them every day on my way home at about 4:30, 5 o'clock. And for the past 6 months, I've seen one car leave at that time, and that's just me driving by this one particular thing. But I think we try to. Planning board, select board brought 2 projects and multifamily ones, and they both failed at a recent town meeting. And one of the things was traffic. There was also community character and density. But a lot of housing projects, it's traffic, public safety, that sort of thing. I think that's where people see it, and we know that through traffic studies and data that if you're replacing a commercial entity with a residential entity, the traffic is usually almost always lower. And again, that data that Doug showed that only about half of Wellesley's commuters drive alone to work. So there's a high amount of work from home. Obviously, these communities that we're in are all cut-through communities, so we got people driving through Wellesley. So it's not just Wellesley traffic, but it's people coming through Newton, Needham. So that's one thing. But when you see cars on the road, you don't care what cars they are; they're just in the way and clogging traffic. So that's just one.
Anybody else in the panel want to answer that one, or have anything else you want to say that you didn't get to say?
Sure.
Okay, you go ahead.
I think traffic is one of those things that, people have the doomsday vision of, oh my gosh, it's going to be Armageddon and it's, everything's going to be clogged up. But that never happens. It never happens. The projects get built and there's people that come in and out, and, it kind of averages out. And while people don't believe it during the review process, the traffic studies are actually pretty accurate, and they really do predict what kind of traffic is going to be. It's usually a worst case scenario, so it's not as bad as even that predicts. But and I don't know how we can correct that perception. But
okay, Michaela has her hand raised, and I want to let her just.
These are sort of 2 comments in response to what I'm hearing now, and to answer the question in a better way than I should have answered on my panel. But for you all, from sort of a developer and a resident, this is the traffic. As part of this permitting process I went through in Newton, I dug up old articles on Trio and 28 Austin Street. I have verbatims from community participants, city councilors saying that this would be the end of the world and traffic. There should be a post-mortem 5 years later on what the actual impact, showing that there is an impact. Because your point, Steve, the traffic reports are done to the most conservative degree on purpose. And then the other piece is just, Eric, this is something you mentioned about Wellesley. 40B is a real viable permitting path to build housing in the state. But everyone views 10% as the maximum. You got to get to 10, then you're done. The legislation says 10% is the minimum. We really need to change that mind shift, and I think it can start with planning and the ZBAs, and I don't know how to do it, but just
I just have one more thought. When you're stuck in traffic, maybe think about Tiffany and William and Michaela trying to get her kids to daycare. They're not bad people. They're just trying to get somewhere.
Thank you. All right, perfect way to end. My appreciation to these folks and to their communities for the partnership we have and for being here today, and to all of you being part of this program. We really appreciate it. Thanks to Rockland Trust and our other sponsors. Everybody have a great day.